In 1932 and 1933, vast stretches of Ukraine fell silent. Villages that had endured war, revolution, and civil conflict began to empty. Fields that once fed millions lay untended, even as grain shipments continued to leave the countryside under armed guard. By the spring of 1933, hunger had become universal across large parts of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Entire communities were reduced to waiting for relief that did not come, waiting for a policy shift that never arrived. By the time the famine subsided, millions were dead, and the social fabric of rural Ukraine had been permanently altered. The catastrophe unfolded within the political framework of Joseph Stalin's consolidation of power in the Soviet Union. Following the upheaval of the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, Ukraine had been incorporated into the USSR in 1922. During the 1920s, the new economic policy allowed limited private trade and small-scale farming. In Ukraine, this period saw partial recovery from earlier famines and wartime devastation. Agricultural production slowly improved, and Ukrainian cultural life experienced a brief revival under policies of Ukrainization, which promoted local language and administration within the Soviet system. By the late 1920s, however, Stalin sought rapid industrialization. The first five-year plan, launched in 1928, aimed to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial state. To finance industrial growth, the government relied heavily on grain exports. Private peasant farming was viewed as inefficient and politically unreliable. In response, the state introduced forced collectivization, compelling peasants to join large collective farms known as kolkhozy. Land, livestock, and equipment were to be pooled under centralized control. Resistance was widespread. Many peasants, particularly those labeled kulaks, a term used broadly for relatively better-off farmers, were accused of sabotaging grain procurement. The campaign of dekulakization resulted in arrests, deportations, and executions across the Soviet countryside. In Ukraine, where agriculture formed the backbone of the economy and where national identity had been politically sensitive, collectivization met especially strong opposition. Livestock numbers declined sharply as peasants slaughtered animals rather than surrender them to collective farms. Agricultural output fell during the transition. Despite these disruptions, state grain procurement quotas remained high and in some cases were increased. In 1930 and 1931, officials pressed local authorities to meet ambitious targets. When deliveries fell short, party cadres and security forces intensified searches for hidden grain. Penalties for non-compliance became severe. By 1932, the situation had worsened. A poor harvest compounded systemic disruption, yet procurement quotas were not adjusted proportionally to the reduced yield. In August 1932, the Soviet government enacted a decree commonly known as the Law of 5 Years of Grain, criminalizing the theft of socialist property, including small amounts of grain from collective fields. Thousands were sentenced under this law. In Ukraine, local officials, under pressure from Moscow, implemented measures to enforce procurement. Brigades entered villages to confiscate grain, foodstuffs, and in some cases seed reserves. House-to-house searches were conducted to locate concealed supplies. By late 1932, hunger was widespread in rural districts. Reports from local authorities indicated deteriorating conditions, yet central policy remained focused on fulfilling state grain requirements. In November 1932, special commissions led by senior officials were dispatched to Ukraine to enforce quotas. Villages that failed to meet procurement targets were placed on blacklists. These communities faced trade blockades, withdrawal of goods, and intensified searches. Access to manufactured products was restricted, and credit was suspended. In January 1933, internal passport regulations were expanded to prevent peasants from leaving famine-affected regions in search of food. Travel from Ukraine and the North Caucasus was restricted. Security forces intercepted those attempting to reach cities or cross republic boundaries. Archival documents show that central authorities were aware of widespread hunger by early 1933. Requests from Ukrainian officials for reduced quotas or food relief were limited in effect. Some aid was eventually distributed, but it proved insufficient to reverse the crisis. Mortality rose sharply in the spring of 1933. Demographic studies conducted decades later estimate that between 3 and 4 million people in Soviet Ukraine died as a direct result of the famine, though exact figures remain debated due to incomplete records and the suppression of data at the time. The famine also affected other regions of the Soviet Union, including parts of the North Caucasus and Kazakhstan, but Ukraine experienced some of the highest losses relative to population. The social consequences were profound. Rural households were dismantled as family members perished or were separated. Traditional village life, already disrupted by collectivization, was further eroded. Collective farms continue to operate, but with depleted labor forces and traumatized communities. Schools closed in some areas due to lack of attendance. Birth rates collapsed, contributing to long-term demographic decline. Economic effects extended beyond immediate mortality. The destruction of livestock herds during collectivization and famine reduced agricultural productivity for years. The state eventually moderated procurement policies after 1933, and the harvest of that year showed improvement. However, the countryside had been transformed. Private farming was effectively eliminated. Collective and state farms became permanent fixtures of Soviet agriculture. Politically, the famine coincided with a broader tightening of control over Ukraine. In 1933, Soviet authorities curtailed policies of Ukrainization, reversing earlier cultural concessions. Prominent Ukrainian intellectuals and officials were arrested during the subsequent purges. The intersection of famine and political repression reinforced Moscow's authority over the republic. Some historians argue that the severity of procurement measures in Ukraine reflected not only economic priorities but also concerns about national resistance. Archival evidence indicates that Ukrainian regions were subjected to particularly strict enforcement, though interpretation of intent continues to be debated among scholars. International awareness during the famine was limited and contested. Foreign journalists based in Moscow faced restrictions on travel. Some reported severe food shortages, while others downplayed or denied the scale of the crisis. Diplomatic correspondence from several countries acknowledged reports of widespread hunger. Nonetheless, the Soviet government officially denied the existence of famine. Statistical data on population losses were suppressed, and the 1937 census, which revealed significant demographic decline, was invalidated and its organizers punished. Within the Soviet Union, discussion of the famine was silenced for decades. Official histories omitted or minimized the events of 1932 to 1933. Survivors rarely spoke publicly, as acknowledgement could invite political risk. Only in the late 1980s, during the period of glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev, did open discussion begin to emerge. Archival materials were gradually released, enabling more systematic research. The question of whether the Holodomor constitutes genocide has been the subject of extensive scholarly and political debate. The term Holodomor, derived from Ukrainian words meaning hunger and extermination, gained prominence in the Ukrainian diaspora during the Cold War and was later adopted within independent Ukraine. Some historians and governments argue that the famine in Ukraine was intentionally directed against the Ukrainian nation, citing the combination of punitive procurement measures, movement restrictions, and concurrent cultural repression. Others contend that the famine resulted from broader Soviet policies applied across multiple regions, emphasizing class-based rather than national targeting. The interpretation remains contested in academic and diplomatic arenas. In 1991, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine declared independence. The famine of 1932 to 1933 became central to national memory and identity. Monuments were erected, and official commemorations established. In 2006, the Ukrainian parliament formally recognized the Holodomor as genocide. Several other countries have adopted similar resolutions, while others refrain from using that designation. The debate reflects differing legal interpretations and geopolitical considerations. Demographic research continues to refine estimates of mortality and regional variation. Scholars analyze archival procurement records, local administrative reports, and demographic data to reconstruct the sequence of events. While precise figures may remain uncertain, there is broad consensus that the famine was one of the most severe human-made catastrophes in 20th century Europe. It occurred not in the context of war or natural disaster alone, but within a framework of state policy, centralized economic planning, and coercive enforcement. The long-term legacy extends beyond demographic loss. The experience of famine shaped attitudes toward state authority, agriculture, and national identity in Ukraine. Rural collectivization endured until the collapse of the Soviet Union, influencing patterns of land use and economic organization for generations. The memory of 1932 to 1933 has also influenced contemporary political discourse, particularly in discussions of sovereignty and historical justice. By the time harvests improved in late 1933, the immediate crisis had passed, but the consequences were lasting. Villages were repopulated slowly. Orphans were absorbed into institutions or extended families. Collective farms stabilized under stricter administrative oversight. Yet the silence that had descended in the spring of 1933 left an enduring imprint. Statistical tables, censored census results, and internal memoranda testify to the scale of loss. For decades, the absence of public acknowledgement compounded the tragedy. Today, historians approach the Holodomor through multidisciplinary research, drawing on archival documents, demographic modeling, and survivor testimony recorded in later years. While debates over classification and intent continue, the documented facts establish that millions perished during a period of forced collectivization and rigid grain requisitioning. The famine was intertwined with broader processes of industrialization, political consolidation, and repression that defined Stalin's rule. The events of 1932 to 1933 demonstrate the consequences of state power exercised without effective accountability. Agricultural policy, security enforcement, and political ideology